Hi, everyone. I'd like to share a story with you, a kid's story. It's one of my favorites. If you've been around kids, or worked in the nursery or something, you probably have read this story maybe many times. It's called the Story of the Three Trees. And I think it's especially powerful at these times like Christmas or Advent. We're in the season of Advent as we approach Christmas. As we think about Jesus, we think about the meaning of Christmas and the power of the gift of God. It's just huge. And children's stories sometimes are very helpful at bringing across very powerful truths. So let me read the story of the three trees. Once upon a mountaintop, three little trees stood and dreamed of what they wanted to become when they grew up. The first little tree looked up at the stars and said, "I want to hold treasure. I want to be covered with gold and filled with precious stones. I'll be the most beautiful treasure chest in the world." The second little tree looked out at the small stream trickling by on its way to the ocean. "I want to be traveling mighty waters and carrying powerful kings. I'll be the strongest ship in the world." The third little tree looked down into the valley below where busy men and women worked in a busy town. "I don't want to leave the mountaintop at all. I want to grow so tall that when people stop to look at me, they'll raise their eyes to heaven and think of God. I will be the tallest tree in the world." Years passed. The rain came, the sun shone, the little trees grew tall. One day, three woodcutters climbed the mountain. The first woodcutter looked at the first tree and said, "This tree is beautiful. It's perfect for me." With a swoop of his shiny axe, the first tree fell. "Now I shall be made into a beautiful chest. I shall hold wonderful treasure," the first tree said. The second woodcutter looked at the second tree and said, "This tree is strong. It's perfect for me." With a swoop of his shiny axe, the second tree fell. "Now I shall sail mighty waters," thought the second tree. "I shall be a strong ship for mighty kings." The third tree felt her heart sink when the last woodcutter looked her way. She stood straight and tall and pointed bravely to heaven. The woodcutter never even looked up. "Any kind of tree will do for me," he muttered. With a swoop of his shiny axe, the third tree fell. The first tree rejoiced when the woodcutter brought her to a carpenter's shop. But the carpenter fashioned the tree into a feed box for animals. The once beautiful tree was not covered with gold, nor with treasure. She was coated with sawdust and filled with hay for hungry farm animals. The second tree smiled when the woodcutter took her to a shipyard. But no mighty sailing ships were made that day. Instead, the once strong tree was hammered and sawed into a simple fishing boat. She was too small and too weak to sail on an ocean or even a river. Instead, she was taken to a little lake. The third tree was confused when the woodcutter cut her into strong beams and left her in the lumberyard. What happened? The once tall tree wondered. All I ever wanted was to stay on the mountaintop and point to God. Many, many days and nights passed. The three trees nearly forgot their dreams. But one night, golden starlight poured over the first tree as a young woman placed her newborn baby in the feed box. "I wish I could make a cradle for him," her husband whispered. The mother squeezed his hand and smiled as the starlight shone on the smooth and sturdy wood. "This manger is beautiful," she said. Suddenly the first tree knew he was holding the greatest treasure in the world. One evening, a tired traveler and his friends crowded into the old fishing boat. The traveler fell asleep as the second tree quietly sailed out into the lake. Soon a thundering and thrashing storm arose. The little tree shuddered. She knew she did not have the strength to carry so many passengers safely through the wind and the rain. The tired man awakened. He stood up, stretched out his hand, and said, "Peace." The storm stopped as quickly as it had begun. And suddenly, the second tree knew he was carrying the King of heaven and earth. One Friday morning, the third tree was startled. When her beams were yanked from the forgotten woodpile, she flinched as she was carried through an angry, jeering crowd. She shuddered when soldiers nailed a man's hands to her. She felt ugly and harsh and cruel. But on Sunday morning, when the sun rose and the earth trembled with joy beneath her, the third tree knew that God's love had changed everything. It had made the third tree strong. And every time people thought of the third tree, they would think of God. That was better than being the tallest tree in the world. The next time you feel down because you didn't get what you want or what you expect, sit tight and be happy, because God is thinking of something better to give you. Okay. I'd like to take a brief intermission, but we're not going to do that. I've already made a mess of this. Might as well finish it. The enormity of what God has done. It is just, it's so much and it's so big. And when we look at Scripture, we can see that this has been God's loving plan for so long. I love what Hal's doing with his Facebook Live teachings on Advent, helping us to see some of the key I don't want to say symbols, it's the power of the environment that when God comes in human flesh in baby Jesus. It is so big. The way in which the land was in darkness for so long, the silence, the heaven was silent for 400 years, which is the same length of time that the Israelites were in bondage in Israel. And in this darkened state, in this darkness comes the light of the world. Micah chapter 5 verse 2 speaks of the light coming. I'm going to read it. This is where we have the prophetic utterance about Bethlehem being the place where Jesus would be born. Micah 5:2, but you Bethlehem, then it has Ephrathah, which identifies, there's a couple of different Bethlehems identifying Bethlehem. Though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one who is to be ruler in Israel. The one, and it's a capital O, who is to be ruler, and that's a capital R. And the text speaks forth that this isn't an exceptional human being. This is God incarnate. Out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth are from old, from everlasting, who is eternal, going back, no beginning, always has been. We get that from Micah. We have a few other verses, prophetic verses, that speak to the incarnation or the coming of Jesus. Isaiah 11 is one that is very familiar. Isaiah 11 says, there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse. It's a way of saying this will be born in the lineage, the family tree of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. And so Jesus is referred to as the son of David. There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, a branch, capital B, and rod is capital R. A branch shall go out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. With the righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his loins, and faithfulness the belt of his waist. These are extraordinary things that are said about this branch. There's another verse that refers to Jesus prophetically as the branch. It's in Zechariah chapter 3 verse 8, and he's referred to, God says, my servant the branch, and it's capitalized. And again, it's speaking to the divine nature of the coming one. And these verses, these prophecies, are hundreds of years before Jesus is born. Isaiah chapter 9 is one that we're probably most familiar with about the coming of Jesus. And This is probably 750 or 760 BC. The prophet says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice. From that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this." The two things that come after the beautiful names of Jesus: Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Each name having tremendous message and telling us about not just who Jesus is, but what he is going to do and his relationship to humanity and our existence in eternity and the kingdom of God, and all of it. It's compressed into these names. And right after that, it says, "Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end." Government and peace. I'll say one thing about those two words, and then we'll conclude. Government, in our culture today, it's almost a dirty word, government. And certainly through periods of history when there were kings or different kinds of rulers that were not benevolent, that were not good, that were not faithful, or were not godly, the government was to be feared and obeyed. And government is viewed as an institution of this earth, of humanity, of this world, and always always exhibits, I should say, one way or another, sinful behavior and corruption and all of that. That has nothing to do with this verse. When it says government, it's talking about what maybe the ideal for what a government is supposed to be, or in the purest sense of what that word is in the kingdom. Government is order. Not order under force, it's just order that exists because everything is right and good. It's an administration where things are as they should be, or things are in their rightful place. Things aren't corrupted or broken. Things are correct and good and right. It's something that creates a character of society that is godly and holy and pure. It is the environment of prosperity, of peace, and of hope, and of complete and joy. The total absence of fear and those things that go with it that are the work of darkness, all of that removed. And the qualities and the character and the person of God expressed in a living environment. That's the government of Jesus. And of his government there will be no end. And this happens because he leaves his position as the second person in the Trinity and is born in human flesh in Bethlehem. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. For the sake of redemption, whosoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life and live in an eternity where this reality is the norm. The character and the beauty and the glory and the perfection of God expressed in a living form, that we will be in that government. And it's just a great promise of God. And alongside of that, because he's the Prince of Peace, and because there is this additional quality of peace that isn't just some kind of inner tranquility, but this is the blood flowing through the kingdom of heaven, the peace of Jesus flowing through us and giving us life, that we will be in perfect peace. And that gives it opens doors, it creates the opportunity for the more of God, the abundant life to exist and to continue in this context of perfect peace. His government and his peace, there will be no end. Now, it isn't just for then, right? We know this. It's what God is doing in us. And he's been doing this in us ever since we came to a place of saying, come into my life, Lord. Help me. Help, Jesus. Help. And so think about those three trees. Because we always think this is what's going to happen. And this is the direction it's going to go. And this is how it's going to turn out. With God, it's always a surprise. And it's always good. It's always beautiful. It's always powerful. Wow. Wonderful Counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. I want to encourage you to be of this mind to receive the surprise that God has for you this Christmas season, because there's always a surprise with God. And each one of us, God has something he wants to give us, do in us, reveal to us, that is a complete and total surprise. It's a work he wants to do. He wants to take advantage of our openness and our willingness to receive. So I want to encourage you to be on the lookout for the surprise that God has for you this Christmas season. God bless you and your church. We'll see you next time.